Good day, and today we're looking at the part 2 of our series from anti-transcendentalism, in specific the discussion of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And the first thing we want to talk about is that Moby Dick today is considered a great major work of American literature. It is often frequently cited as the great American novel. A lot of times you might hear about Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn as well, but Moby Dick is certainly often cited as one of our great American novels. It is referenced constantly in popular culture. If you're looking, you'll see it everywhere, from TV shows such as The Sopranos, to Mad Magazine, to newspapers like The Onion, maybe even perhaps in popular cartoons. So of the novel, Herman Melville wrote at the time, "I've written a wicked book and feel spotless as the lamb." He also wrote that he felt that this was his true masterpiece. The readers at the time, however, did not agree. He was mostly unknown until we had a Herman Melville revival of the 1920s, long after Herman Melville's death, and his book, at the time he put it out, had rotten sales. So the next thing I want to discuss about Herman Melville is his life story. Melville's material is the kind of stuff that can only be born of a particular sort of life experience, an experience that was precipitated by some key events in his life. We start off with Melville's younger days. His father was unsuccessful in business. He was importing at the time, and his bankruptcy was too much for him to handle. He fell ill and died when Herman Melville was just 12. As a result of the family's financial troubles and the death of his father, Melville couldn't afford to go to college. As it was up to him to support his mother and sisters, he needed a good-paying job. Therefore, he joined a merchant ship in 1837. At that time, whaling was hugely profitable, as whale oil was used for fuel in homes. And at sea, his adventures included desertion, captivity, and even enlistment in the U.S. Navy. So when we look at the very beginning of his story of Moby Dick, Melville wrote in his character Ishmael, "A whale ship was my Yale College and my Harvard." Well, this must certainly be true of Herman Melville himself. He took his experiences and wrote 2 wildly popular travel narratives shortly after he came home, and he called them Typee and Umu. Now, these describe his time as a captive among a cannibal tribe in the Marquesas Islands and his experiences as an explorer in the Polynesian Islands. Now, these were popular at the time, but Herman Melville was growing bored of writing these shallow travel narratives, and he began writing deeply philosophical and experimental books full of symbolism. His book Marty was such a book, and he considered it great art, but the public hated it, and he needed money, so he wrote a few more shallow, crazy travel narratives that were more popular. Now, when Herman Melville writes the book Moby Dick and publishes it in 1851, he knew it was a great masterpiece. He knew it was a good book. But in 1851, it was a commercial failure, and he was extremely disappointed with this. He became very bitter toward the American reading public, and afterward, his physical and mental health declined sharply due to his struggle with terrible debt, as he tried desperately to support his family, which he had 4 children at the time, as well as his mother and sisters. Now, when we look at Herman Melville's writing, he called writing at the time the great art of telling the truth. Now, he believed that he and his good friend Nathaniel Hawthorne needed to probe the most profound truths, however dark, truths that most people could not bear to see. So thus, we can read Moby Dick as a meditation, an extended and serious study on truth, or as part of Melville's great quest for truth. But how does one execute such a reading? What should we be looking for? Well, we have our 2 characters that will be following along in the story, and both Ishmael and Ahab are on a search for the truth. Both pursue this truth in the form of the whale Moby Dick. So you can read the whale as a symbol for their truth. Now, Ishmael tries to find his truth by trying to understand the whale from every angle possible. Now, at first it seems that Ishmael thinks it's possible, if one studies and thinks enough, to find a true understanding with the whale. Now, it does seem odd to say we're trying to understand a whale, but you can also extend this out to the idea of nature, which means you're going to be bringing in God, man, perhaps even the entire universe when you decide to discuss nature. Now, Ishmael tries to put together a complete classification system for whales and to analyze them from every angle. And this is probably where some of the boring symbolism stuff comes in, but there is a meaning behind this. Ishmael realizes that this is a never-ending project. He could study the whale and pursue the meaning of the whale forever. And for him, the whale is full of meaning. He describes the search for knowledge and truth as a branching tree that never ends, that will always be going after the whale. And this, for Ishmael, does not discourage him. Now, when you read about the chapters on cetology, the study of whales, which are an attempt to dissect the whale and find its understandable meaning, it is an attempt to discover the truth. Read the whale as Ishmael's truth. And hopefully, understanding this will help you avoid whining about how boring it is to learn about the study of whales. It feels like a biology or some sort of science class. That's not what Melville was going for. Read the whale as Ishmael's truth, his trying to understand nature. Now, what does he find out? Ishmael finds that the whale is such a huge topic, his study's never going to be complete. And what he shows us is that the world is so full of meaning that you're never going to be able to grasp all of it. However, he's not daunted by that. He believes we should still try. The effort is not futile. It is awesome and worthy. That quest, that life is the journey and life is the quest for truth, is still an awesome thing to behold. Now, your other character, Ahab, also has a quest. But by contrast, it's not one to classify whales in general, but to avenge himself on a very specific whale. So if whales are supposed to be the truth, his quest for truth is not generative. It's not going to create more branches. Instead of creating, it's destructive. It is zeroing in on one target. Now, Ahab is enraged by his inability to understand Moby Dick, which he views with the same understanding as an absolute truth of the universe. Ahab and Ishmael are both looking at this whale as a nature. However, where we want, Ishmael to learn more and to get creative and to branch out, Ahab is viewing the whale as a malicious force. The universe must be evil. It must be destroyed. Now, Ahab calls the white whale the inscrutable thing. He's furious about the limits of his understanding that we have. He calls this limitation a wall. He wants to break through the wall by finding the whale, and that's going to be his understanding, the destruction of it. Now, notice that wall and whale are going to echo each other. Watch out for symbolism. Herman Melville is really good at it. Well, how does this again help you? Well, both men view the whale as holding an ultimate truth. Ishmael can live with the understanding that the whale is both incredibly meaningful and it's ambiguous, it's mysterious. You can understand some of it, but not all of it. And with Ishmael, that's okay. I can understand some of it, but not all of it. I will continue pursuing it. I'm cool with that. Ahab cannot live with that. He doesn't want the constant pursuit. He doesn't want the kind of ambiguous, mysterious understanding. He believes that this truth should be destroyed. So what do we learn? Everything has many meanings. The idea of truth is ambiguous. Back in part 1, we talked about how in Romanticism, and of course in specific the anti-transcendentalists that we have Herman Melville writing in, we're always after to pursuing our own individualized truths, which is going to make it ambiguous. Truth is going to be different for everybody. And the universe is so vast that it's just going to be incomprehensible to man. We just can't give one understanding of it. So that's going to give us the fourth key point. Everything can be interpreted in many, many ways. So early on, Ishmael writes about the sperm whale's eyes, and he can see two different views at once, unlike man. So obviously, this invites us to read the story in multiple ways. See everything in at least two different viewpoints, maybe even from multiple angles. So let's look for multiple interpretations of perhaps the painting that you have in the Spouter Inn, the doubloon that is stuck to the ship for the person who sees Moby Dick. Maybe even look for multiple interpretations of Moby Dick himself. And then, of course, there might be other symbols as well. Yes, I know this is getting long, but let's look at the idea or the sense of mashing up this particular novel. It's kind of like an encyclopedia of forms. First of all, you do see a dictionary. We're going to start describing whales, cetiology itself. It might look like a whaling manual. They're going to describe to you how to go and get those whales. But there's also what this book is, a sense of fiction. You're going to have times where there's some comedy, some tragedy, there's an epic that is being written with an adventure, there might be some prophecies and sermons here. You might be looking at it as almost a soliloquy drama, body humor, tales within tales. There might even be allusions to people such as Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible, other adventure narratives from the past, technical books that describe whaling manuals. Don't write all this down, but like we've been saying, if there's so many truths just in the whale itself, there are so many different multiple meanings to the symbols, the novel itself you can also read in several different ways. So it's so hard. Why is there so many forms? Well, Melville's trying to look at the whale from every angle possible. He's also trying to look at the novel as a literary form from every angle possible. Now, in this way, Melville pursues that crazy generative, ever-building and growing tree branch of knowledge that Ishmael talks about. Melville is going to show that knowledge is vast and that can and should be pursued among millions and bajillions of different attitudes. It should be an awesome experience. And you should understand that if you read Moby Dick a second time, a third time, a 23rd time, you could read it differently every single time. And Herman Melville would love that. Now, if he's writing in his anti-transcendentalist period, there's also going to be a reaction to his time periods. For example, to religion. Now, early theories of evolution, increasing scientific developments, and a new study of the Bible as a product of history, rather than divine revelation that came through the Enlightenment period at this time, is now creating a crisis of faith in the Western world. During the Romantic period, people were asking, is there a God and how do we interpret it? Well, Melville is going to use Ishmael, which is an outcast named after the biblical outcast of Abraham's son, as a metaphor for humanity that has lost its sustaining beliefs and is now in search of a new meaning. Perhaps Moby Dick himself, the whale, is constantly being compared to nature and as a god itself. In a sermon, God came upon Jonah in a whale, while the whalemen believe Moby Dick is a supernatural, almost immortal being. And a sailor prophet says, Moby Dick is God reincarnated. Thus, if we read the search for Moby Dick as a search for God or a search for an understanding of God, you can also read it as a search for truth. Secondly, you might want to consider the politics of the times. In 1850, the nation was in crisis over slavery. We were also continuing to subjugate and exterminate Native Americans as Americans continued to move and settle out west. Now, both forms of subjugation were underwritten by smug assertions of the civilized of their supremacy over what they might have called savage races. So Melville's novel is going to explore this issue. So at first, Ishmael accepts American racial hierarchy, so that first, when he meets Queequeg, a South Sea Islander who happens to be a pagan and a cannibal, Ishmael is first repulsed and even afraid of Queequeg. Soon, though, he chooses the kind and heroic Queequeg over a hypocritical Christian civilization. He says, "I'll try a pagan friend, thought I, since Christian kindness has proved but hollow courtesy." And as you watch the rest of the novel, Ishmael and Queequeg are going to form a loving friendship. Little Pip is also subjected to the fearful and violent power of racism. Now, Pip, a small African-American cabin boy, trembles in fear before the big white god Moby Dick. Now, this passage asks us to see not only a spiritual, but also a racial dimension to Moby Dick's whiteness. So what's that supposed to mean? Well, we're meant to read Pip against Moby Dick. Pip is representing what it means to be African American in that time, meaning perhaps he's feeling kind of small in the world, perhaps helpless in his society. And Moby Dick, the white whale, could be considered a fearful and almost omnipotent force. Now, remember, there are many ways to interpret Moby Dick. This is just one of multiple interpretations. So, a bit of a recap for you. First, this is an awesome book. You could read this book once, you could read it 20 times, and come away with a different feeling book every time. Second, Herman Melville had an actual whaling experience, and his book was a failure at first. It seems to be odd that here he is talking about his truths and his experiences, and even though his shallow travel novels did very well and they were popular, this book failed until long after Herman Melville had passed on. Thirdly, this is a book about truth. When you think of anti-transcendentalism symbolisms, when you think of the romantic movement of nature, when you think the ideas of religion and politics during the time period all coming in, Herman Melville wants you to explore your own truths, a very classic romantic ideal. Everything in this book can have multiple meanings, so be careful which meanings you want to pick with, but once you start deciding, I'm going to read this as a whaling manual, or I'm going to read this straight up as fiction adventure novel, stick with it and look for your meanings and truth in that aspect. It borrows from multiple forms to represent the vastness of knowledge and truth. Again, you can read this as a biology book on whales. You can read this as a whaling manual. You can read this from a sense of, I'm going to look for just the symbolisms. I'm going to look for just the politics in the book. You're not going to be able to understand all of it in the first reading. Just like Ishmael is not able to understand his quest throughout. It keeps branching off. And Herman Melville would be happy with that. It's also a response to the crisis of faith in the 1950s and a crisis of morality in the form of racism. And perhaps this is why the book was kind of a failure at first. It had so many different truths in it that didn't hide or sugar over any of the capabilities of what people were supposed to be discussing and thinking at the time, that it might have just been too much for his particular audience at the time. Thank you so much for stopping by to have a little bit of a pre-discussion about Moby Dick. If you'd like me to actually go into the chapters of Moby Dick and have a discussion chapter after chapter, leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think about the book. And as always, thanks for stopping by.